Good morning. I want to begin with a question. This is actually a very pivotal question for the remainder of our lives here on earth. And with this question, I will begin the next series. Rapture or no rapture? Many of us were raised in a fairly Protestant environment where the doctrine of rapture was very prominently put forth. Obviously, there's books and movies about it, and songs. But I want to exhort me and I want to exhort you to be Bereans and compare what you hear to what you know of the Word of God. Unfortunately, if we're raised in something, we're steeped in it. We're baked into it, and it's very hard to see uh, necessarily if it's true or not because it was given to us by those we trust. This is an important question because I think we agree that we're in the last days. I think that's not a controversial topic, and no one knows the day or the hour, so it could be this year, it could be 10 years from now, it could be 15 years from now. Certain prophets are saying 11 years, which says to me, live as if we're in the last days, which the Word of God's been telling believers as long as there's been a Word of God, live as if God could come back today. If there is a rapture, then you, spirit-filled, sealed believer, will not have to endure any of the difficult things talked about in the book of Revelation, which means you don't have to be ready, either in terms of character, in terms of relationships, in terms of any aspect of your life that relates to that. But if there is no rapture, if it cannot be supported equivocally in the Word of God, then you, believer, are going to be enduring these things and ought to be thinking about how we approach them. The main verse that is used to describe the word from which people gather the concept of rapture is in 1 Thessalonians 4, and we're going to read it in a moment. But we have to separate between two things. Either there is no rapture and Jesus comes back once. There's a resurrection, there's a drawing up of the living and the dead into heaven. And it's a massive, glorious event without a separate extra component. Or if there is a rapture, is as if Jesus comes back a previous additional time. And then who is it who is caught up into the air after the resurrection? So you have to determine what the contradictory portion is. So directly after the bodily resurrection, in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, it says, "We who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them into the clouds to meet the Lord in the air." So this is the resurrection and being caught up into the air. Now the parousia, or caught up into the air, or rapture, is a single word that occurs a couple of times, upon which has been built the idea that there's a special separate event that's not superficially visible, by which believers are taken off the earth. And so that would mean there's two second comings. One where he comes back and commits the rapture, and a second one where he comes back and does the resurrection and draws us into heaven. So ask yourself if there's two second comings. Secondly, if it doesn't make more sense that 1 Thessalonians is talking entirely about the resurrection of the dead and those who are upon the earth. So who's that upon the earth if it is not believers that are waiting for Jesus to come back? So it's my conclusion that anything that has been used to build the idea of a rapture is not supportable. It is, if you were to read about it, you would see that it's a fairly new doctrine, the idea of Christianity. The early church would not have talked about this concept. It is a new Christian doctrine that is not universally accepted throughout the Christian church. It is a very Baptist idea. And a couple of other denominations. It's not a non-idea, but it's become popularized by songs, books, movies, and I believe it appeals to us because, A, you don't have to be around to experience the bad things that are coming, the persecution, and then D, who does get to stick around? Bad people you'd like to see punished. So it creates a very reassuring view for those that don't want to be around for the events of the book of Revelation. So this series is predicated on the idea that there will be an end times church that is physically present in the days preceding Jesus' return. In a world beset by the four horsemen, by a false world, false peace-bringing new world government, by wars, by pestilence, by famine, with broken infrastructure and oppression and persecution enacted upon the church. I'm going to ask a series of questions, give a series of insights, about 20 of them, maybe 21, in the broad categories of how that will affect our relationships, our gatherings, the concept of open doors as described in the church at Philippi, or Philadelphia, ministry, and rebellion. Now I say rebellion quite carefully because we're going to have massive changes in world law, massive changes in what is considered normal or healthy or legal, and every believer is going to have the quandary of when do I make a distinction between the reasonable obedience to civil government and deciding that I must follow God in spite of it. I live in a place where, for the most part, the government has not made too many massive demands that say, this is the opposite of the Word of God, you have to do it. There have been little bits of that, but more is coming. And behavior that is now legal as well as compliant to what the Word of God says will increasingly enter areas where it is pleasing to God and displeasing to your government, displeasing to your neighbors. And one has to determine which side they're on. So that's the beginning of the End Times Church. Hope that you watch the whole thing. Please like and subscribe.